Marcus Chun had always been terrible at reading alien social cues. 3 years of diplomatic training at the Terran embassy hadn't changed that fundamental flaw in his character. He was a translator, not a diplomat, and certainly not someone who should be wandering around the most important political gathering in the Andromeda sector without a proper escort. The Zephyrian Grand Assembly was a marvel of architectural achievement. Crystalline spires stretched toward twin purple suns, their surfaces refracting light into dancing patterns that would have been beautiful if Marcus wasn't so completely lost. He clutched his translation device tighter, watching streams of beings from dozens of species flow through corridors that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. Ambassador Williams had been very clear about Marcus's role today. Stay in the translation booth. Don't wander. Don't touch anything. And, for the love of all that's holy, don't accidentally insult anyone. The last instructions seemed particularly relevant now, considering Marcus had absolutely no idea where he was or how he'd ended up in what appeared to be a private wing of the assembly complex. The corridors here were quieter, more elegant. Soft bioluminescent panels provided gentle illumination, and the air carried a faint scent of something like jasmine mixed with ozone. Marcus had been following what he thought were directional markers for the past 20 minutes, but the symbols seemed to shift every time he looked away. Zephyrian architecture was notorious for its psychological effects on non-native species. He rounded another corner and nearly collided with a towering figure in midnight blue robes. The being's face was hidden beneath a deep hood, but Marcus caught a glimpse of silver skin and eyes that seemed to hold entire galaxies. The figure paused, seemed to assess him for a moment, then glided away without a word. Marcus watched them go, noting how other beings in the corridor immediately pressed themselves against the walls in what was clearly a gesture of deep respect. The encounter left Marcus more unsettled than before. He was definitely not supposed to be in this section of the complex. The beings he'd seen here moved with the careful grace of predators, their clothing and bearings suggesting they occupied positions of significant authority. He needed to find his way back to the public areas before someone decided he was a security threat. That's when he saw the gardens. Through an archway that hadn't been there moments before, Marcus glimpsed an impossible vista. A crystalline dome stretched overhead, filled with what looked like a piece of captured sky, complete with floating islands and waterfalls that defied gravity. The space was enormous, easily large enough to house several city blocks, yet it felt intimate and peaceful. Marcus knew he should turn around. Every instinct screamed that he was trespassing in a space reserved for beings far more important than a nervous human translator. But the gardens called to him with an almost magnetic pull. The stress of the day, the confusion of being lost, the constant pressure of trying not to make a diplomatic incident. It all seemed to meld away as he stepped through the archway. The gardens were even more beautiful up close. Paths wound between clusters of plants that seemed to sing in harmonious frequencies just below the range of human hearing. Streams of luminescent water curved through the air in impossible spirals, occasionally forming temporary pools that reflected images of distant stars. Marcus found himself following one of the main pathways, drawn deeper into this pocket of tranquility. He wasn't the only visitor. Scattered throughout the gardens were beings engaged in what appeared to be meditation or quiet conversation. They paid him no attention, though Marcus caught several surreptitious glances in his direction. His human appearance was clearly unusual here, but not unwelcome enough to cause alarm. Perhaps the gardens were more public than he'd assumed. The central area of the space featured a series of terraced amphitheaters arranged around a crystalline fountain. The fountain itself was a work of art, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to tell the history of the Zephyrian civilization. Water, or something like water, flowed upward from its base, forming complex patterns in the air before gently settling back into collection pools. It was here that Marcus made his critical error. The terraces were arranged in a specific pattern, with some sections clearly designated for particular purposes. Marcus, exhausted from his wandering and overwhelmed by the beauty of the space, simply chose the first available seat he found. It was in the front row of one of the smaller amphitheaters, positioned to provide an excellent view of the fountain. The seat itself was clearly designed for humanoid anatomy, though it was larger than necessary for his frame and carved from what appeared to be a single piece of purple crystal. He settled into the seat with a sigh of relief, finally allowing himself to relax. The stress of the day began to drain away as he watched the hypnotic patterns of the fountain. The sounds of the garden, the singing plants, the whisper of flowing water, the distant murmur of conversation, created a symphony of peace that he hadn't experienced since arriving on Zephyria. Marcus was so absorbed in the tranquil atmosphere that he almost missed the subtle change that began to occur around him. Conversations grew quieter. Movement became more measured and deliberate. The casual wandering of other garden visitors transformed into something approaching a formal procession. By the time Marcus noticed these changes, it was too late to react appropriately. A figure approached his section of the amphitheater, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The being was clearly Zephyrian, tall and elegant, with the characteristic silver skin and flowing movements of her species. But this was no ordinary representative of the Zephyrian people. Her robes were woven with threads that captured and reflected light like living metal. A circlet of what appeared to be crystallized starlight rested on her forehead. Most telling of all, every other being in the gardens had either prostrated themselves or retreated to respectful distances. Marcus was sitting in the presence of royalty. Not just any royalty. Based on the reactions around him, this was likely someone from the highest echelons of Zephyrian society. Possibly even the queen herself. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to move. To stand, bow, apologize, and remove himself for what was obviously a reserved space. But his body seemed frozen, trapped between the fear of making the situation worse and the growing certainty that any movement now would only draw more attention to his mistake. The regal figure seemed to glide rather than walk. Her movements possessed of an otherworldly grace that made Marcus feel clumsy just by comparison. She was heading directly toward his section of the amphitheater, and with each step, Marcus's panic grew. He'd heard stories about diplomatic incidents that started with far less significant breaches of protocol. His presence here could damage relations between Earth and Zephyria for generations. She reached the row where he sat, and Marcus held his breath. This was it. He would be arrested, expelled from the planet, possibly imprisoned for trespassing in what was clearly a sacred or restricted space. Ambassador Williams would have his hide, assuming Marcus survived whatever punishment the Zephyrians deemed appropriate for his transgression. The Queen, Marcus was now certain that's who she was, paused at the end of his row. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, drowning out the peaceful sounds of the garden. Then, to his absolute astonishment, she moved into the row and took the seat immediately beside him. The seat she chose was slightly larger than his own, clearly designed for her species, but positioned close enough that he could have reached out and touched her robes. The implications of her choice crashed over Marcus like a tidal wave. She had deliberately chosen to sit next to him rather than demand his removal. Either she didn't realize he was an uninvited intruder, or she was choosing to overlook his presence for reasons he couldn't begin to fathom. Marcus sat frozen, afraid to breathe too loudly. The Queen's presence beside him was overwhelming in ways he struggled to process. There was something about her that transcended mere physical beauty or political authority. She radiated a sense of ancient wisdom and power that made Marcus feel like a child in the presence of a force of nature. She turned slightly toward him, and Marcus caught his first clear glimpse of her face. Zephyrian features were always striking to human eyes, but hers possessed a quality that bordered on the divine. Her skin held the characteristic silver tone of her species, but it seemed to glow with inner light. Her eyes were the deep purple of twilight skies, flecked with points of light that moved like distant stars. When she spoke, her voice was like music made audible. "You are far from where you belong, young translator." The words were spoken in perfect galactic standard, though Marcus detected an accent that suggested vast age and education. More troubling was the casual way she'd identified both his profession and his status as an outsider. She clearly knew exactly who he was and why he shouldn't be here. Marcus opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to grovel if necessary. But before he could speak, she continued. "Do not rise," she said, and Marcus felt something that might have been her hand brush against his arm. The contact was brief, barely perceptible through his diplomatic uniform, but it sent a shock through his entire system. "Stay." The simple command carried weight that transcended mere words. It wasn't a request or even an order in the traditional sense. It felt more like a fundamental law of the universe, as natural and unquestionable as gravity. Marcus found himself settling deeper into his seat, his muscles relaxing despite his racing thoughts. "Your Majesty," he began, but she raised one graceful hand to silence him. "Here, I am simply Lyralii." The Gardens recognized no titles, no ranks, no divisions between species or worlds. Here, there's only the peace of growing things and the wisdom of flowing water. Marcus nodded, though he had no idea how to respond. The informal introduction was clearly a privilege, but it also felt like a test. The wrong response could still trigger a diplomatic incident, regardless of the peaceful setting. "I am Marcus Chun," he said carefully. "I serve as a translator with the Terran diplomatic mission. I believe I may have become lost and wandered into a restricted area. If my presence here is inappropriate, I will gladly withdraw." Lyralii, the queen, seemed to consider his words for a long moment. When she finally responded, there was something that might have been amusement in her voice. "Lost," she repeated. "Yes, I suspect you are indeed lost, though perhaps not in the way you imagine." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, movement at the edge of the garden caught his attention. A group of figures had entered the space, moving with the purposeful stride of security personnel. They wore the dark blue uniforms of the Zephyrian Royal Guard, and their bearings suggested they were searching for something or someone. Marcus felt his stomach drop. They were looking for him. His unauthorized presence in the restricted areas had been discovered, and now they were coming to collect him. He started to rise, preparing to surrender himself and hopefully minimize the diplomatic damage. "Do not move," Lyralii said, and again Marcus felt that strange compulsion to obey. "They are not here for you." The guards reached the amphitheater area and immediately spotted the queen. Their reaction was instant and profound. They dropped to one knee in perfect synchronization, heads bowed in respect. The lead guard, distinguished by additional insignia on his uniform, spoke in the flowing, musical language of the Zephyrian nobility. Marcus didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. The guard was reporting something urgent, something that required the queen's immediate attention. She listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. When the guard finished his report, Lyralii was quiet for several heartbeats. Marcus could see her processing the information, weighing options and consequences with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire worlds. Finally, she responded in the same flowing language. Her words carried the weight of absolute authority, and the guard's posture shifted subtly in response. Whatever she had told them, it was clearly not what they had expected to hear. The lead guard spoke again, his tone suggesting respectful questioning or perhaps concern. Lyralii's response was shorter this time, but delivered with the kind of finality that brooked no argument. The guards rose, bowed again, and withdrew from the garden with the same purposeful stride that had brought them there. Marcus waited until they were gone before speaking. "Your Majesty, Lyralii, I don't want to cause problems for you. If there's some crisis that requires your attention, please don't feel obligated to the crisis," she interrupted gently. "Is precisely why your presence here maybe more important than you realize. She turned to face him more directly, and Marcus found himself caught in the gravity of her gaze. There was something in her expression that suggested she saw more than just a lost translator who had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. "Tell me, Marcus Chun of Earth," she said, "what do you know about the concept of serendipity?" The question caught him off guard. Serendipity? It refers to fortunate accidents, I suppose. Happy coincidences that lead to unexpected discoveries or opportunities. Yes, Lyralii said, and Marcus caught a hint of what might have been a smile. The humans have always had interesting words for things that other species consider mysteries. We Zephyrians believe that the universe occasionally conspires to bring certain individuals together at precisely the right moment for precisely the right purpose. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the garden's controlled atmosphere. "I'm not sure I understand. The crisis my guards reported involves your species, Marcus Chun. A situation has developed that threatens not only the diplomatic mission you serve, but potentially the relationship between our peoples. The traditional channels of communication have proven inadequate, and time grows short." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made Marcus feel as though she were reading his soul. "And then," she continued, "a human translator wanders lost through our most sacred spaces, finds his way past security measures that should have been impossible to circumvent, and seats himself in the one location where I would be certain to encounter him during my moment of greatest need for human insight." The implications of her words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. She was suggesting that his presence here wasn't an accident, or at least not the kind of accident he'd assumed. Whether through cosmic coincidence or something more deliberate, he had somehow positioned himself to play a role in resolving a crisis he didn't even know existed. "What kind of crisis?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Lyralii was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving to the crystalline fountain with its ever-changing patterns of water and light. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "Your people are young, Marcus Chun. Young and brilliant and terrifying in their potential. You have achieved in mere millennia what took most species eons to accomplish. Your capacity for growth, for adaptation, for overcoming impossible odds. It is remarkable. It is also deeply unsettling to those who have grown comfortable with the existing order of things." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. "Are you saying someone sees humanity as a threat?" "I am saying that someone has decided your species represents an unacceptable variable in their carefully ordered vision of the future. They have taken steps to ensure that humanity's expansion into the greater galactic community will be severely limited, if not ended entirely." The peaceful sounds of the gardens suddenly seemed muted and distant. Marcus stared at the queen, trying to process the enormity of what she was telling him. An unknown enemy was actively working against humanity's place in galactic civilization, and somehow, through the strangest series of accidents imaginable, he had ended up in a position to learn about it. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Lyralii turned back to face him, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that might have been hope. Because she said simply, "I believe the universe has provided us with an opportunity. The question now is whether we possess the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to act upon it." The silence stretched between them as Marcus tried to absorb the magnitude of what Lyralii had revealed. Somewhere in the galaxy, forces were moving against humanity, and he had stumbled into knowledge that could make the difference between his species' success or failure among the stars. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. "I need to understand," Marcus said finally. "Who exactly considers humanity a threat? And why are you willing to share this information with me?" Lyralii rose gracefully from her seat, her robes flowing like liquid starlight around her tall frame. She moved to stand beside the crystalline fountain, her fingers trailing through streams of luminescent water that seemed to respond to her touch by glowing brighter. "Come," she said, "walk with me. Some conversations are better conducted while in motion." Marcus followed her deeper into the gardens, past terraced areas filled with plants that hummed in harmonious frequencies. They walked along pathways that seemed to adjust their configuration based on Lyraliai's intentions, always providing exactly the right route to wherever she intended to go. The technology was so advanced and seamlessly integrated that it felt like magic. The hegemony of aligned worlds has governed this sector for nearly 10,000 standard years. Lyraliai began, her pace leisurely but purposeful. It is a confederation of the oldest and most established civilizations, bound together by shared traditions, common goals, and a deep respect for stability and order. Marcus nodded, recognizing the name from his diplomatic briefings. The hegemony was effectively the local galactic government, though it operated more like a loose alliance than a centralized authority. Earth had been negotiating for membership since first contact, but the process was notoriously slow and complex. The hegemony's strength comes from its predictability, Lyraliai continued. Each member species has found their place, their role, their level of influence within the greater structure. Conflicts are rare because everyone understands the established order. Change happens gradually, over centuries or millennia, allowing all parties to adapt at their own pace. They paused beside a grove of trees whose leaves seemed to be made of crystallized music, chiming softly whenever the breeze touched them. Lyraliai reached out to touch one of the lower branches, and the entire grove responded with a complex harmony that spoke of welcome and recognition. Your species disrupts that order simply by existing, she said, and Marcus heard no accusation in her tone, simply statement of fact. Humans achieve in decades what takes other species centuries. You adapt to new environments, new technologies, new concepts with frightening speed. Most concerning of all, you seem to inspire other species to exceed their own previous limitations. Marcus had heard similar observations before, though usually framed as compliments rather than problems. Humanity's rapid development had been a source of pride for most humans, proof that their species belonged among the stars despite their relative youth. The Karathi Syndicate has been particularly vocal about these concerns, Lyraliai said, naming a species Marcus knew only by reputation. The Karathi were among the oldest members of the hegemony, their civilization dating back nearly 50,000 years. They were renowned for their philosophical traditions and their deep commitment to galactic stability. They view human expansion as a threat to the natural order, she continued. Not because humans are violent or destructive, but because you represent change itself. Your very presence forces other species to reconsider their own limitations and possibilities. They emerged from the grove into a circular clearing dominated by sculpture that seemed to shift between different forms depending on the viewer's perspective. From one angle, it appeared to be a representation of the galaxy itself, with spiral arms of crystallized matter rotating slowly around a central core. From another, it looked like a complex mathematical equation made manifest in physical space. The Karathi have spent the last several years building a coalition within the hegemony, Lyraliai said, settling onto a bench that materialized from the ground to her approach. They call it the Preservation Alliance, and its stated goal is maintaining the stability and traditions that have served the galaxy well for millennia. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, and humanity threatens those traditions. According to their arguments, yes. They point to the rapid changes that have occurred in the mere 2 decades since first contact. Species that had remained technologically static for centuries are suddenly pursuing new research initiatives. Trade routes that have been stable for millennia are being restructured to accommodate human commercial practices. Even cultural exchanges are happening at unprecedented rates. The implications were becoming clearer, and Marcus didn't like the picture that was forming. So they want to limit human expansion to prevent these changes? They want to prevent human expansion entirely, Lyraliai said, and the quiet intensity in her voice made Marcus's blood run cold. The Preservation Alliance has drafted a formal proposal that would classify humanity as a destabilizing influence on galactic civilization. If approved by the Hegemony Council, it would effectively quarantine your species to your home system indefinitely. Marcus stared at the shifting sculpture, watching its forms change from galaxy to equation to something that might have been a representation of time itself. The beauty of the gardens suddenly felt hollow, overshadowed by the magnitude of the threat Lyralii had revealed. "But that would destroy everything we've worked for," he said. "All the trade agreements, the cultural exchanges, the scientific collaborations, everything would end." "Worse than that," Lyralii replied. "The proposal includes provisions for severing all communication with Earth except for essential monitoring. Your species would be effectively isolated until such time as you mature to a point where integration becomes safe. Given the Karathi's perspective on proper developmental timelines, that could take tens of thousands of years. The scope of the threat was staggering. Humanity would be cut off from the galaxy just when they were beginning to find their place among the stars. Generations of humans would live and die without ever knowing what lay beyond their solar system. The dream of expansion, of growth, of joining the galactic community, all of it would end before it truly began. "When will this proposal be presented?" Marcus asked. "The formal presentation to the council is scheduled for tomorrow," Lyralii said. "The Karathi have been building support for months, and early indicators suggest they have sufficient backing to ensure passage. The vote is expected to be close, but favoring the Alliance position." Marcus felt sick. Tomorrow. Humanity's future in the galaxy would be decided tomorrow, and Earth didn't even know it was under threat. The diplomatic mission he served was focused on routine trade negotiations and cultural exchanges. Nobody had suspected that humanity's very right to expand among the stars was being challenged. "Why hasn't Earth been informed?" he asked. "Surely they have the right to defend themselves against these accusations." Lyralii's expression grew troubled. The Preservation Alliance has argued that informing humanity of the proceedings would constitute interference in the Council's deliberations. They claim that human representatives would inevitably attempt to influence the outcome through emotional appeals or promises that cannot be guaranteed by such a young civilization. "That's completely unfair," Marcus protested. "How can the Council make a decision about humanity without allowing humans to speak in their own defense?" "The Alliance has framed this as a protective measure," Lyralii explained. "They argue that exposing humanity to the details of the proposal would cause unnecessary distress and might even provoke the kind of destabilizing behavior they claim to be preventing." Marcus stood and began pacing, his mind racing through the implications and possibilities. The situation seemed designed to be impossible to counter. Humanity was being condemned without trial, their fate decided by beings who had already made up their minds about the threat they represented. "But you're telling me," he said, stopping to face Lyralii, "you're Zephyrian royalty, presumably with significant influence in the hegemony. If you oppose this proposal, why can't you simply vote against it?" Lyralii's smile was sad and complex. "Because, Marcus Chun, I am the Queen of Zephyria, and my people are among the founding members of the Preservation Alliance." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stared at Lyralii, trying to process what she had just revealed. The queen of one of the most powerful species in the hegemony was personally informing him about a threat to humanity, a threat that her own people were actively supporting. "I don't understand," he said. "If your people are part of the Alliance, why are you warning me about their plans?" Lyralii rose from the bench and moved to stand beside the shifting sculpture. She placed one hand against its crystalline surface, and the forms within began to move faster, cycling through different configurations with increasing speed. "Because I have lived for over 800 standard years," she said quietly. "I have seen civilizations rise and fall, watch species grow and stagnate, observe the slow dance of galactic politics across centuries. And in all that time, I have learned to recognize the difference between wisdom and fear, The sculpture began to settle into a new form, something that looked like a tree, its branches reaching toward impossible heights while its roots delved deep into the earth below. The Preservation Alliance speaks of stability and order, Lyralii continued, but what they truly advocate is stagnation. They fear change not because it is dangerous, but because it requires effort. It demands growth. It forces individuals and entire civilizations to question comfortable assumptions and explore new possibilities. Marcus moved closer, drawn by the intensity in her voice. And you disagree with that position? I believe that life without growth is not life at all, she said. The galaxy is not a museum to be preserved unchanged for all eternity. It is a living entity that must continue to evolve, to adapt, to reach toward greater complexity and beauty. Your species represents that evolutionary impulse in its purest form. The sculpture had stabilized into its tree-like configuration, and Marcus could see that it was incredibly detailed. Individual leaves moved in an unfelt breeze, while the root system below seemed to extend infinitely downward. It was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling like growth itself. The Zephyrians were once like humans, Lyralii said, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing ancient history. We expanded rapidly through our local region, changing everything we touched, inspiring other species to exceed their previous limitations. We were feared, resented, and occasionally admired for our ability to catalyze transformation. What happened? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. We were convinced to slow down, Lyralii replied, told that our rapid expansion was destabilizing, that we needed to mature before we could safely interact with older civilizations. We accepted limitations on our growth, agreed to gradual integration processes, allowed our natural dynamism to be channeled into approved directions. She turned away from the sculpture to face Marcus directly. It took 3,000 years for us to realize what we had lost. By the time we understood the price of stability, it was too late. We had become exactly what the older civilizations wanted us to be: predictable, manageable, safe. We had traded our potential for acceptance. The weight of her words settled over Marcus like a heavy cloak. Lyralii was describing humanity's possible future, a path that led not to destruction, but to something arguably worse, the slow death of everything that made humanity unique. Is that what will happen to us? He asked. Not if I can prevent it, Lyralii said, and Marcus heard steel beneath the musical quality of her voice. The Preservation Alliance has significant support, but the vote is not yet decided. There are species within the hegemony who remember what growth and change can accomplish. They can be convinced to oppose the quarantine proposal, but only if they understand what is truly at stake. Marcus felt a flutter of hope, though he remained cautious. What kind of understanding do they need? They need to see humanity as it truly is, Lyralii explained. Not the caricature painted by the Preservation Alliance, but the reality. They need to understand that human adaptability is not a threat to be contained, but a gift to be celebrated and learned from. The plan was beginning to take shape in Marcus's mind, though he could already see the enormous challenges involved. You want someone to speak for humanity at the council session. I want humanity to speak for itself, Lyralii corrected. The Alliance has successfully argued that human representatives would be too emotional, too unpredictable to participate in formal proceedings. But they cannot make the same argument about a human who appears to offer nothing more than technical translation services. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he understood what she was proposing. You want me to be there? I want you to be present when the proposal is debated, she said. Officially, you will be there to provide translation services should any linguistic clarification be needed. Unofficially, you will be humanity's witness to its own trial. The magnitude of what she was asking began to sink in. Marcus was a translator, not a diplomat or a politician. He had no experience with high-level negotiations, no training in galactic politics, no authority to speak on behalf of his entire species. "I'm not qualified for something like this," he protested. "I'm just a translator. I don't have the authority to represent humanity or the expertise to counter their arguments." Lyralii moved closer, and Marcus caught the scent of something like jasmine mixed with starlight. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but implacable. "Authority is often claimed by those who seek it, but rarely possessed by those who deserve it," she said. "You found your way to this garden through no map or guidance, past security measures designed by species far older than your own. You sat in the one place where I would be certain to encounter you at the precise moment when such an encounter could change the course of history. Do you truly believe these were merely fortunate accidents?" Marcus wanted to argue, to insist that everything that had happened could be explained by simple coincidence and poor navigation skills. But the rational part of his mind had to acknowledge the astronomical odds against such a series of events occurring naturally. "Even if I accept that some greater force brought us together," he said, "I still don't know what I'm supposed to do. How can one human translator possibly influence a decision that affects the entire species?" "By being exactly what you are," Lyralii replied. "The Preservation Alliance has spent months painting humanity as a faceless threat, a destabilizing force that must be contained for the good of galactic civilization. You will be their first opportunity to see a human being as an individual rather than as a symbol of chaos." She paused, studying his face with those star-filled eyes. "More importantly, you will be humanity's only opportunity to witness the proceedings and understand exactly what arguments are being made against your species. That knowledge could prove invaluable in the years to come, regardless of how tomorrow's vote concludes." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Everything she was saying made sense, but the scope of what she was asking seemed overwhelming. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, one moment of poor judgment could make things worse for humanity rather than better. "What if I fail?" he asked quietly. Lyralii's expression softened, and for a moment Marcus caught a glimpse of the individual behind the royal dignity, someone who had carried the burden of difficult decisions for centuries and understood the price of both action and inaction. "Then, at least your species will know that someone tried," she said. "But I do not believe you will fail, Marcus Chun. The universe has a way of providing what is needed when it is needed most. You are here at this moment because you have something to offer that no one else can provide." The sculpture behind them had begun to change again, its tree-like form gradually transforming into something that looked like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Marcus stared at it, wondering if the transformation was random or if it somehow reflected the conversation taking place nearby. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, "what exactly would be expected of me?" "Tomorrow morning, you will report to the council chambers as scheduled to provide translation services," Lyralii explained. "The session will begin with formal presentations from the Preservation Alliance, followed by questions and debate among council members. Your role will be to remain silent and observant unless specifically called upon for linguistic assistance. And if the opportunity arises to speak, then you speak as yourself," she said simply. "Not as a representative of Earth's government or its diplomatic corps, but as an individual human being who happens to find himself in an extraordinary situation. Sometimes the most powerful arguments are the ones that come from the heart rather than from policy documents." Marcus nodded slowly, though his mind was still racing through the potential consequences of what she was proposing. If things went wrong, he could single-handedly destroy any chance humanity had of eventual integration into galactic society. On the other hand, if Lyralii was right about the timeline, humanity was about to be isolated regardless of what he did or didn't do. "There's one thing I don't understand," he said. "Why are you risking your own position to help humanity? If your people discover that you've been working against their interests, what happens to you?" For the first time since their conversation began, Lyralii's composure flickered. Marcus saw something that might have been pain or regret cross her features before she regained control. "Because 800 years ago, I was given the same choice you face now, she said quietly. I could risk everything to stand for what I believed was right, or I could remain silent and preserve my comfortable position within the existing order. The sculpture completed its transformation into a bridge, and Marcus could see tiny figures walking across its span, moving from one side of the chasm to the other. I chose silence, Lyrelii continued. I told myself that I was being wise, that preserving my influence for future battles was more important than taking a stand in that moment. I've spent the last 8 centuries wondering what might have been different if I had chosen courage instead of caution. Marcus understood. She was offering him the chance she had failed to take, the opportunity to risk everything for the possibility of changing the course of history. Whether humanity succeeded or failed, at least someone would have tried. When do we begin? He asked. The council chambers of the Zephyrian Grand Assembly were designed to overwhelm. Marcus stood in the observation gallery, watching delegates from dozens of species file into seats arranged in a complex geometric pattern that somehow managed to give every participant an optimal view of the central speaking platform. The architecture itself seemed alive, with walls that shifted color and texture in response to the emotional tenor of the gathering. He had spent a sleepless night preparing for this moment, reviewing every piece of information he could access about the species represented in the chamber. The formal roster read like a catalog of galactic civilization, the ancient Karathi with their philosopher kings and their deep commitment to stability, the ethereal luminari whose crystalline forms seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time, the massive Threnodidae whose contributions to galactic engineering were legendary, dozens of others, each representing thousands of years of history and tradition. Against all of that accumulated wisdom and experience, humanity would be judged and quite possibly found wanting. Marcus's position in the translation booth provided an excellent view of the proceedings while keeping him effectively invisible. The booth itself was a marvel of technology, with systems that could analyze and interpret dozens of languages simultaneously. In theory, his presence was purely functional, a backup system in case the automated translation networks encountered difficulties. In reality, he was humanity's only witness to what might be its final judgment. Lyrelii entered the chamber with a procession of Zephyrian nobles, their robes flowing like captured starlight as they took their seats in the section reserved for species royalty. She moved with the same fluid grace Marcus had observed in the garden, but here her demeanor was more formal, more constrained by the weight of ceremony and protocol. She caught his eye for just a moment as she settled into her seat, and Marcus saw something that might have been encouragement in her expression. Then, her attention turned to the proceedings, and she became once again the Queen of Zephyria, bound by the complex responsibilities of her position. The session was called to order by the Council Chancellor, an elderly Karathi whose presence seemed to fill the entire chamber despite his relatively small physical stature. His voice carried the authority of ages, each word carefully measured and precisely delivered. Honored delegates, he began, we gather today to consider Proposal 7.2847, a framework for managing destabilizing influences in galactic civilization. This proposal has been submitted jointly by the Preservation Alliance and carries the endorsement of 47 member species. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. 47 species. That was nearly a third of the hegemony's membership, far more support than he had expected. The proposal was being presented not as the work of a small faction, but as a broad consensus among the galaxy's most established civilizations. The first speaker was Prime Philosopher Kethvar of the Karathi Syndicate, the architect of the Preservation Alliance, and the primary author of the proposal. He was old even by Karathi standards, his pale blue skin marked with the intricate tattoos that recorded his philosophical achievements. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of 50,000 years of accumulated wisdom. Esteemed colleagues, he began, we face a challenge unprecedented in the recorded history of galactic civilization. For the first time in millennia, We must contend with a species whose developmental trajectory threatens the stability that has served us all so well for so long. The opening salvo was exactly what Lyralii had predicted, an appeal to fear disguised as reasonable caution. Kethvar painted a picture of humanity as a force of chaos, unpredictable and dangerous in its rapid development. Consider the evidence, he continued, and Marcus watched as holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, showing charts and graphs that documented human expansion since first contact. In 20 standard years, the humans have established settlements on 14 worlds, initiated trade relationships with 37 species, and begun technological exchanges that have accelerated development across entire sectors. The data was presented as though rapid progress was inherently threatening. Each achievement was framed as evidence of humanity's destabilizing influence rather than as success deserving celebration. More concerning still, Kethvar said, is the effect human contact has had on traditionally stable species. The Altarian Republic has restructured their entire economic system based on human commercial models. The Danubian Collective has abandoned research methodologies that served them well for 3 millennia in favor of human approaches to scientific inquiry. Even the venerable Centauri Federation has begun questioning philosophical frameworks that have guided their civilization for eons. Marcus found himself clenching his fists as he listened. Everything Kethvar described as threatening behavior sounded like positive progress to human ears. Species choosing to adopt new approaches, exploring different possibilities, questioning established assumptions. These were signs of healthy growth, not dangerous instability. But he could see from the reactions in the chamber that many delegates shared Kethvar's concerns. Heads nodded in agreement as the Karathi philosopher detailed each example of human-inspired change. To minds accustomed to thinking in terms of centuries and millennia, the pace of transformation must indeed seem alarming. The proposal before us today, Kethvar continued, is not punitive in nature. Rather, it represents a protective measure designed to serve the interests of all parties involved, including humanity itself. The language was carefully chosen, Marcus realized. By framing the quarantine as protection rather than punishment, the Alliance made it harder for opponents to argue against the proposal without seeming reckless or uncaring. We propose that human expansion beyond their home system be temporarily suspended pending completion of a comprehensive maturation assessment. During this period, existing human settlements would be allowed to continue operating under careful supervision, while new expansion would be prohibited until such time as humanity demonstrates the wisdom and restraint necessary for full galactic citizenship. Temporary. The word hung in the air like a promise, but Marcus remembered Lyralii's warning about Karathi timelines. To a species that measured development in millennia, temporary could easily mean longer than all of recorded human history. Furthermore, Kethvar said, we recommend the establishment of cultural containment protocols to prevent inadvertent contamination of stable civilizations. Human representatives would continue to participate in essential diplomatic and commercial activities, but under strict guidelines designed to minimize their influence on established social and economic structures. Cultural containment protocols. The euphemisms were almost impressive in their creativity. What Kethvar was describing amounted to treating humanity like a disease that needed to be quarantined before it could spread. The Karathi philosopher concluded his presentation with a final appeal to tradition and stability, invoking the names of ancient civilizations that had maintained peace and prosperity for eons through careful adherence to established principles. He painted the Preservation Alliance's proposal as the natural evolution of galactic governance, a mature response to an unprecedented challenge. The chamber fell silent as Kethvar returned to his seat. Marcus could feel the weight of history pressing down on the proceedings, the accumulated expectations of countless generations who had built their lives around the assumption that change would come slowly and predictably. Then, Chancellor spoke again, calling for questions and commentary from the assembly. What followed was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of support for the Alliance position. Species after species rose to express their concerns about human influence, sharing examples of disruption and uncertainty that had followed contact with Earth's representatives. The Vorthan Confederacy described economic instabilities caused by human trading practices. The Calarian Unity spoke of social upheaval triggered by human philosophical concepts. The ancient Praetorian Empire detailed military innovations inspired by human tactical thinking that had forced them to completely restructure their defense strategies. Each testimony followed the same pattern: acknowledge humanity's good intentions, describe the disruptive effects of human contact, and express support for the Alliance's protective measures. It was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to make opposition seem unreasonable or even dangerous. Marcus watched from his booth, feeling increasingly helpless as the case against humanity built inexorably. The translation systems were functioning perfectly, requiring no intervention from him, and he began to wonder if his presence here would make any difference at all. Then, something unexpected happened. A delegate from the Altarian Republic rose to speak, and Marcus immediately noticed that she was not following the script that had guided previous speakers. Instead of expressing support for the proposal, she began by questioning its fundamental assumptions. "Honored Chancellor," she said, "while I respect the concerns raised by our Karathi colleagues, I must ask whether we are truly addressing the right problem. The changes described as destabilizing have, in many cases, been voluntary adoptions of practices that have proven beneficial to our peoples." A murmur ran through the chamber. This was not what the Alliance had expected to hear from a species they had specifically cited as an example of human disruption. The economic restructuring described by the Alliance representatives, the Altarian continued, resulted in a 40% increase in productivity and a dramatic reduction in resource waste. Our people chose to adopt human commercial practices because they work better than what we were doing before. Marcus felt a spark of hope. The Alliance had made a critical error by using specific examples of human influence. They had assumed that all the affected species would view those changes as negative, but clearly that wasn't the case. More delegates began to speak up, and Marcus realized that the Alliance's presentation was having an unintended effect. By detailing so many examples of human influence, they had reminded other species of the benefits that contact had brought. The Danubian representative spoke about breakthrough discoveries that had only been possible through human research methodologies. A Centauri delegate described philosophical insights that had enriched their civilization's understanding of consciousness and identity. Even some species that had initially seemed supportive of the Alliance began expressing reservations about the scope of the proposed restrictions. The tide was turning, but slowly. For every species that spoke in favor of continued human expansion, two more expressed concerns about the pace of change. The chamber remained divided, and Marcus could see that the final vote would indeed be close. That's when Chancellor called for a recess, ostensibly to allow delegates time to consider the arguments they had heard. In reality, Marcus suspected it was to give the Alliance leadership time to regroup and address the unexpected opposition to their proposal. As delegates filed out of the chamber for private consultations, Marcus found himself alone in the translation booth, wondering what he could possibly contribute to the proceedings. The debate was being conducted at a level far beyond his expertise, involving political and philosophical considerations that required decades of experience to fully understand. A soft chime from the booth's communication system interrupted his thoughts. A message had arrived, marked with the royal seal of Zephyria. When he opened it, Marcus found a single line of text. "The bridge is strongest at its center. Trust in the moment when it comes." The message was unsigned, but Marcus recognized Lyraliai's influence in both the words and the timing. She was reminding him that his role in these proceedings was not to be a politician or philosopher, but simply to be human at the moment when humanity needed representation most. The second session began with renewed presentations from Alliance supporters, clearly designed to address the objections that had been raised during the earlier debate. They emphasized the voluntary nature of their proposal, the temporary character of the restrictions, and the protective benefits for humanity itself. But something had shifted in the chamber's dynamics. The initial presentation had been too successful in documenting human influence throughout the galaxy. Delegates who had forgotten the positive aspects of that influence had been reminded, and many were reconsidering their positions. The debate grew more heated as the afternoon progressed. Ancient alliances began to strain as species found themselves on opposite sides of what was becoming a fundamental question about the future of galactic civilization. Should diversity and innovation be celebrated, or should stability and tradition take precedence? Marcus watched it all from his booth, acutely aware that he was witnessing history in the making. The decisions reached in this chamber would shape the destiny not just of humanity, but of every species in the galaxy. Future generations would judge whether they had chosen growth or stagnation, courage or fear. As the formal debate period neared its end, Chancellor announced that any delegate who wished to make a final statement would be given the opportunity to do so. This was the last chance for persuasion before the vote was called. One by one, species representatives rose to offer their concluding thoughts. The statements were largely predictable, reiterating positions that had been established during the earlier debate. Alliance supporters emphasized stability and caution. Opposition voices called for openness and growth. Then, something unprecedented happened. A malfunction in the translation systems caused several delegates to speak in their native languages without immediate interpretation. The automated systems began producing garbled output, mixing languages and concepts in ways that made communication impossible. Chancellor called for a brief pause while technicians worked to resolve the issue, but the backup systems were also experiencing difficulties. For the first time since the session began, there was a genuine need for human translation services. Marcus felt his heart racing as he realized what was happening. The moment Lyrelii had referenced was here, the opportunity to contribute that he had been waiting for without knowing what form it would take. He activated his booth's override systems and began providing real-time translation for the affected delegates. The work required complete concentration, but it also gave him something else, a reason to be heard. As the technical difficulties were resolved and normal translation services restored, Marcus found that he had earned something invaluable: the attention and gratitude of delegates who had been struggling to communicate their positions. Chancellor formally thanked him for his assistance, and then asked if he had any observations about the linguistic challenges they had just experienced. This was it. This was the moment Lyrelii had somehow foreseen, the opportunity for a human voice to be heard at the center of humanity's trial. Marcus stood in his booth, acutely aware that every eye in the chamber was now focused on him. The weight of representing his entire species pressed down on his shoulders, but he also felt a strange sense of calm. He knew what he needed to say. "Honored delegates," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I am grateful for this opportunity to address the assembly, though I wish it were under different circumstances." Marcus stood in the translation booth, looking out at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. Every face was turned toward him, every eye focused on the human who had unexpectedly found himself at the center of his species' most critical moment. The silence was complete, weighted with anticipation and consequence. "I am Marcus Chun," he began, his voice steadier than he had expected. "I serve as a translator with Earth's diplomatic mission, and I realize that my presence in these proceedings is unusual. I am not a politician or a philosopher. I have no authority to speak for my government or my people. I am simply a human being who happens to find himself in an extraordinary situation." He paused, gathering his thoughts and drawing strength from the memory of Lyrelii's word about speaking from the heart rather than for policy documents. "Over the past several hours, I have listened to detailed discussions about humanity's impact on galactic civilization. I have heard us described as a destabilizing force, a threat to established order, a species too young and unpredictable to be trusted with full galactic citizenship. Marcus could see delegates shifting in their seats, uncertain about where his statement was leading. Some appeared sympathetic. Others seemed impatient or concerned about the precedent of allowing a non-delegate to address the assembly. I do not dispute many of the facts that have been presented, he continued. Humans do adapt quickly. We do seek new solutions to old problems. We do question established assumptions and explore alternative approaches. These are not behaviors we chose to adopt for political reasons. They are fundamental aspects of who we are as a species. A murmur ran through the chamber as delegates began to recognize that this was not going to be a standard diplomatic defense of human actions. But I would ask you to consider why these traits developed in the first place. Marcus said, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm. Humanity evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill us. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, climate shifts that occurred faster than most species could adapt. Earth taught us that survival required constant change, continuous adaptation, relentless innovation. He gestured toward the viewing screens that still displayed data about human expansion and influence. The behaviors that concern the Preservation Alliance are not flaws to be corrected or immature impulses to be controlled. They are the survival mechanisms that allowed us to not only endure, but thrive in an environment that would have destroyed more static species. Marcus could see that he had the chamber's attention now. Even delegates who had seemed hostile to human presence were listening intently. You speak of the changes that have occurred since first contact, as though they were imposed by force or deception, he continued. But every example cited by the Alliance represents a voluntary choice made by intelligent species who evaluated human approaches and found them beneficial. No one was coerced. No one was deceived. They simply chose to adopt practices that served them better than what they had before. The Altarian delegate nodded approvingly, and Marcus drew courage from the gesture. The Preservation Alliance asks you to fear human influence because it accelerates change, he said. But I would ask you to consider what the alternative really means. They are asking you to preserve a galactic civilization that has already made every discovery, solved every problem, answered every question. They envision a future where growth stops, where exploration ends, where the greatest achievements of your children will be to maintain what their ancestors built. Marcus could see Chancellor frowning, clearly concerned about the direction of the statement, but no move was made to interrupt him. Is that truly the legacy you want to leave? Marcus asked. A galaxy so committed to stability that it has forgotten how to grow? Civilizations so devoted to tradition that they have abandoned the possibility of becoming something greater than they are today. He moved to the front of the booth, making himself more visible to the entire assembly. Humanity offers something different, he said. Not a threat to what you have built, but a reminder of what you might yet become. We offer the possibility of growth, of discovery, of achievements that none of us can yet imagine. Yes, that future includes uncertainty. Yes, it requires abandoning the comfortable assumption that the way things are is the way things must always be. Marcus paused, scanning the faces in the chamber and seeing a mixture of emotions. Curiosity, concern, consideration, and in some cases something that might have been hope. But consider the cost of the alternative, he continued. The Alliance proposes to quarantine humanity not because we are evil or destructive, but because we represent change itself. They want to preserve a galaxy where the greatest ambition is to remain exactly as we are today, forever. He could see that his words were having an impact. Delegates were leaning forward, engaging with arguments they hadn't expected to hear. I will not pretend that rapid change is easy or comfortable, Marcus said. Growth often requires abandoning familiar patterns, questioning comfortable assumptions, accepting that the methods that served us well in the past may not be optimal for the future. But the alternative, stagnation disguised as stability, is not preservation. It is slow death. Marcus found himself thinking of Lyraliai's words about the Zephyrian's own experience with enforced maturation, and he drew on that cautionary tale. Some of you here today remember what it was like when your own species first reached for the stars, he said. You remember the excitement of discovery, the thrill of growth, the joy of becoming more than you had ever been before. The Alliance asks you to deny that same opportunity to humanity, and, in doing so, to deny it to yourselves as well. The chamber was completely silent now, focused entirely on Marcus's words. I ask you to imagine a different future, he continued. A galaxy where humanity is not quarantined as a threat, but welcomed as a partner. Where human adaptability combines with Karathi wisdom. Where human innovation builds upon Zephyrian artistry. Where human determination supports Altarian commerce and Danubian research. Marcus could see Lyraliai in the royal section, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with attention. Imagine discoveries that none of our species could make alone. Imagine problems solved through the combination of different perspectives. Imagine achievements that require not the uniformity the Alliance advocates, but the diversity that humanity represents. He took a deep breath, preparing for his final argument. The choice before you today is not really about humanity, he said. It is about what kind of galaxy you want to live in. Do you choose a future defined by the fear of change or the hope of growth? Do you preserve what you have by ensuring that nothing new can threaten it? Or do you protect what you value by ensuring that it continues to evolve and improve? Marcus gripped the edge of the booth, putting everything he had into his closing words. Humanity is not asking you to abandon your traditions or forget your wisdom, he said. We are asking you to remember that the greatest traditions have always been those that embrace growth, and that the deepest wisdom has always recognized that life itself is change. He straightened, meeting the eyes of delegates throughout the chamber. If you quarantine humanity, you will indeed preserve the galaxy exactly as it is today, he concluded. But you will also ensure that it never becomes anything more. The choice is yours, but I would ask you to remember that once growth stops, it very rarely begins again. Marcus stepped back from the booth's edge, his statement complete. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, heavy with the weight of the decision that lay ahead. Then, Chancellor called for the final vote. The process was conducted electronically, with each delegation's position recorded simultaneously to prevent influence from early results. Marcus watched the voting indicators appear on screens throughout the chamber, each one representing a species' decision about humanity's future. The results were closer than anyone had expected. When the final tally appeared, Marcus felt his heart stop. The motion to implement the Preservation Alliance's proposal had failed by a margin of 3 votes. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the chamber as delegates processed the outcome. The proposal that had seemed certain to pass just hours earlier had been defeated, though barely. But the narrow margin told its own story. Galactic civilization remained deeply divided about humanity's role in its future. The quarantine had been prevented, but the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Chancellor formally announced the results and declared the session concluded. As delegates began to file out, many stopped to speak with colleagues, clearly intending to continue the debate in private settings. The vote had ended the immediate threat, but it had not ended the larger controversy. Marcus remained in his booth, watching the chamber empty and trying to process what had just happened. He had somehow managed to influence the course of galactic history, but the victory felt fragile and incomplete. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. This time, it was a formal communication from Chancellor requesting Marcus's presence in a private meeting room. The message was brief and gave no indication of its purpose, but Marcus suspected he was about to face consequences for his unprecedented intervention in the proceedings. The meeting room was smaller and more intimate than the Grand Chamber, with seating arranged to encourage conversation rather than formal presentation. Marcus found Chancellor waiting for him, along with several other figures he recognized as senior delegates for various species. "Mr. Chun," Chancellor said, his tone unreadable, "your contribution to today's proceedings was highly irregular." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, preparing for formal censure or worse. It was also, Chancellor continued, precisely what this assembly needed to hear. The admission caught Marcus completely off guard. He had expected criticism, not praise. The Preservation Alliance raised legitimate concerns about the pace of change in galactic civilization, Chancellor explained. But they failed to adequately address the question of whether slowing that change was worth the cost of stagnation. Your perspective reminded us that growth and stability are not necessarily incompatible. One of the other delegates, a luminary whose crystalline form refracted the room's light into rainbow patterns, spoke in harmonious tones that the translation system rendered as music made verbal. "The young human speaks truth about the nature of life," she said. "Growth that stops is death that has not yet been acknowledged. The Alliance offered us preservation, but preservation of what? Of the assumption that we have already achieved perfection." A Threnodai representative, whose massive frame dominated one corner of the room, added his own perspective in a voice like distant thunder. "The proposal would have prevented disruption," he rumbled, "but disruption is often the price of improvement. The humans have shown us methods of construction that we had not considered in 3 millennia of building. Should we reject such gifts because they require us to reconsider our assumptions?" Marcus listened to the discussion with growing amazement. The vote had not simply defeated the Alliance's proposal. It had apparently catalyzed a broader reconsideration of galactic civilization's relationship with change itself. "There will be challenges ahead," Chancellor warned. "The Alliance has significant support, and they will not abandon their concerns simply because of one vote. The question of how to manage rapid change in a diverse galactic community remains unresolved. But," added the Luminary delegate, "we now approach that question with a broader perspective. The human contribution has reminded us that change and growth are natural processes, not threats to be contained." As the meeting concluded, Marcus found himself being escorted not to a detention facility or deportation center, but to a diplomatic reception in his honor. The irony was not lost on him. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a lost translator wandering through restricted areas. Now he was apparently a diplomatic figure worthy of formal recognition. The reception was held in the same gardens where he had first encountered Lyralii, though the setting felt entirely different in the context of an official function. Representatives from dozens of species mingled among the singing plants and impossible waterfalls, engaged in conversations that would shape policy for years to come. Lyralii found him standing beside the crystalline fountain, watching the ever-changing patterns of luminescent water. "You did well," she said simply. "I still can't believe any of this actually happened," Marcus replied. "Yesterday, I was nobody special. Today, I apparently helped change the course of galactic history." "Perhaps," Lyralii suggested, "you were always someone special, and yesterday was simply the first day you had the opportunity to prove it." Marcus considered her words, thinking about the impossible series of coincidences that had brought him to this moment. "Do you really believe the universe conspired to put me in that garden at exactly the right time?" he asked. Lyralii smiled, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the wisdom that came from 800 years of experience. "I believe the universe provides opportunities," she said. "Whether those opportunities are recognized and acted upon depends entirely on the individuals who encounter them. You could have chosen to remain silent today. You could have decided that the situation was beyond your ability to influence. Instead, you chose to speak when speaking mattered most." She gestured toward the garden around them, filled with representatives of species that had just voted to preserve humanity's place among the stars. The result speaks for itself. As the reception continued into the night, Marcus found himself engaged in countless conversations about humanity's future role in galactic civilization. The narrow vote had created opportunities that wouldn't have existed if the decision had been more decisive in either direction. Species that had been uncertain about the alliance proposal were now actively interested in exploring closer relationships with Earth. But, perhaps more importantly, the entire debate had forced galactic civilization to confront fundamental questions about its own values and direction. The comfortable assumption that stability was always preferable to change had been challenged, and many species were discovering that they weren't as committed to stagnation as they had believed. The immediate crisis had passed, but Marcus understood that the larger story was just beginning. Humanity had earned the right to continue expanding among the stars, but that expansion would be watched carefully by species still uncertain about the long-term implications of human influence. As he stood in the gardens where everything had started, surrounded by beings from across the galaxy who were actively planning collaborative futures, Marcus reflected on the strange path that had brought him here. A simple translation error had led to him becoming lost in restricted areas, which had resulted in an accidental encounter with alien royalty, which had ultimately placed him at the center of the most important vote in recent galactic history. Perhaps Lyralii was right about the universe providing opportunities when they were most needed. Or perhaps it really had been nothing more than an extraordinary series of coincidences. In the end, Marcus decided it didn't matter which explanation was correct. What mattered was that when the moment came, when his species needed someone to speak for the value of growth and change and possibility, he had found the courage to stand up and be heard. The gardens sang around him with the voices of 1,000 different plants, each contributing their own unique note to a harmony that was greater than any individual melody. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor for the future that lay ahead, a galaxy where diversity was celebrated rather than feared, where growth was welcomed rather than contained, where the universe's endless capacity for becoming something greater than it had been before was finally acknowledged and embraced. Marcus smiled, watching the fountain's eternal dance of light and water, and looked forward to whatever tomorrow might bring.